Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Winter with a new series of guides by popular demand on just the basics. This guide will be about Ultralisks and how to use them, when to use them, and most importantly, how to kill them. One of the most asked questions about Ultralisks. Let's talk about a few things first. Ultralisks require Hive Tech, which is expensive and pretty easy to scout. You need an Ultralisk Cavern, which is also relatively expensive. And the most important upgrade, if you look here, this is on the Ultralisk Cavern, Kindness Plating. It gives +4 armor to Ultralisk, which means you deflect a ton more damage and take a lot less overall. This upgrade is pretty much required for Ultralisk to be effective, but once it's in play, it is very difficult to kill Ultralisk with many units, like Marines, or Adepts, or Zerglings, or anything that does low amounts of damage and attacks quickly. And that's what Ultralisks are good for. Let's take a look at how to see that upgrade. If you have Enable Enemy Unit Selection enabled, then, which you should. I think it's enabled by default now, thanks Blizzard. You can look down when clicking on the enemy unit, and if the armor is 4, additional 4 on top of usually the weapon upgrades. I've given the Ultralisk 2 upgrades here, which is usually about what's finished by the time Kindness Plating should be finished. If you see that +4 armor, you gotta know. One on your side, your Ultralisks are now in God mode, and on the opponent's side, you're gonna have to take some special precautions. Now, Ultralisks excel when they're up against a lot of small, low damage units that attack quickly, especially when they clump up, because Ultralisks can slice hard, and they have the splash damage. As you see, they just chop through those unupgraded Zerglings. Or you can go back, give a Terran player, let's say some Marines and Marauders. That's a big one. That's a pretty decent chunk, right? If we look at the supplies here, it's actually 55 for the Terran player and 30 for your Zerg player. We're going to give the Terran combat shields, stim, and 2/2 upgrades. So, a pretty solid mid-game army you see a lot of the time. We're going to bring in 30 supply of Ultralisks, and the Stim Marines and Marauders are just going to attack them. Now, this is the scenario I get a lot of questions about. Once they get Ultralisks, how do you kill them? Now we see, obviously, if you're a Zerg player, you probably understand at least the basics of what Ultralisks are good for. You're good at killing those mid-game armies. Those armies that people make early on are not so well equipped to deal with a high-tech unit like Ultralisks. So now we're going to talk about how to counter Ultras. Now the biggest matchup I get the most questions about is in Terran versus Zerg. Terran versus Zerg, where Terran players usually are building this Marine Marauder type of army early on. Well, very first off, you never want to fight Ultralisks on the field like this. You never want to fight Ultralisks like this. If you're on the open field, well, that's mostly your fault. There's a lot of maps that are not like this, so we're going to switch up. This is the ideal scenario to be fighting Ultralisks, right? Like, let's say you have Marine Marauder this time. We've already got our upgrades. We're going to get that about the same supply as last time. And so the Ultralisks have to come through the choke point. Obviously, this is a great engagement point, and most Zerg players will not be walking right through to their deaths here, but a little bit more spread out. It's still not going to go well, but it's going to go better. And that's with no micro there whatsoever. That's just the power of the angle. The Ultralisks still win. But a couple medevacs would definitely change the story. Let's go to a more realistic engagement angle here. Here we go. And we see a slight ramp here. Usually you'll have something like that. Now this is how you want to set up as a Terran player. Especially if you're stuck on biological units. Ideally you want to have some depots. Maybe a bunker, something like that. Let's assume you don't necessarily have a hard wall. let's say you're on mostly the open field and you only have this space to work with. Well, what you're gonna need, the most basic unit to counter Ultralisk. Well, you need some medevacs with your army. That's pretty important. And a big one, Liberators. Now, beforehand, what you want is to scan, and you need to know that army is coming. So if you're gonna engage on the open field, you know the Ultralisks are coming. Before they even get here. And that's with no upgrades on the Liberators. And ideally you're fighting with those Liberators in front. Now remember, this is a basic guide. A lot of players at the higher levels will see all those Liberators sieged up and not attack in. But all you have to do is set yourself up in a good position. Maybe you're trying to attack your opponent's base. Say the Ultralisks are over here. You can use the Liberators to make it... What are you doing, folks? You can use the Liberators to make it almost impossible for those Ultras to attack up. You can cut off those choke points, and that's what Liberators are great for. And Liberators also give you the added bonus of anti-air against Mutalisks and Corruptors, and maybe eventually Broodlords. So that is your standard counter. You could also use, if you're feeling real micro-intensive, Ghosts. The idea is like maybe 2 Ghosts per Ultralisk. But let's see how they do. You scan to have vision of the Ultras. And the snipe's obviously very good. You just need to make sure you have vision. You need to know if there's a lot of Zerglings coming in to distract your units. And that's the important part. Now, those are just the basics if you're getting a move by Ultralisk. This is not an advanced guide here. Let's go ahead and set this up with a Protoss army. And this is the most realistic type of setup here. A Protoss army to counter Ultralisk is probably the most basic one because it's usually mass murder. Beautiful. But the most basic unit is the Immortal. Ideally 2 Immortals per Ultralisk. This is the kind of army you want to have when you're dealing with Ultralisk here, because you're going to have a lot of Zerglings in there. Let's throw some Zerglings in the mix. Probably should have had that before, but you're dealing with Zerglings with relatively good upgrades. Let's even give them Adrenal Glands, which is the standard Hive tech. But this is what your army wants to look like, something like this. If you can throw in a few High Templar for Storm, that's icing on the cake. But there's a couple important things here in this fight. The Immortals are just the counter to Ultralisk. All you need to do is make sure... What do you do? How did you get stuck in this? Well, the principles will still apply. But this army's going to come down. Obviously, it's going to get crushed. But what you want to do with your Immortals is click on these Ultralisks and shift-click between the Ultralisks. Because otherwise, if they have a bunch of Zerglings, your Immortals are going to be stuck attacking them. Immortals are the counter. You can use things like Void Rays or Dark Templar, but you want Archons in front to soak up the Zerglings. And then you want the Immortals behind to slam into the Ultras. And they do slam. This is with 0/0 upgrades, by the way. I didn't even give them upgrades. They just crush them because they do so much damage. It punches through that armor and chunks up the Ultras. So just the basic counter there. Alright. Now, as Zerg, you're facing Ultras. You've gotten to a weird game at this point. But one counter, because I'm going to speculate on how you got to this point. Because this happens sometimes in my games. Your opponent's going Ultralisk because they started out with Mutalisks. And there's a good chance he went for Hydralisk to counter it. But then they saw you were going for Hydralisk, and Ultralisk kind of destroy Hydralisks alone, right? Or even Roach Hydra. It kind of tears into it. What you're going to want is Lurkers. Broodlords are another okay option if you can turtle up enough, but Ultralisk kind of just shrug off Broodlords unless you have enough of them, and Ultralisk can move very quickly, so that's another concern. I gave him to the wrong guy. Let's go ahead and throw him over here. And we'll say maybe you have a few roaches in front. You should never have your Lurkers alone unless you know they're safe, like behind Spine Crawlers or the like. But yeah. And we'll even give Mr. Red Zerg here. We'll give him a few more ultras. Alright. So, and he's going to get detection. So we can see the lurkers here. But let's go ahead throw in... By this point, you should probably have comparable upgrades, something like 2-2. I'm trying to make it semi-realistic. But this is just the counter at the lower levels. You do this right, and you'll kill these ultras. Alright. Let's say he wants to attack into your base here. Just casually blow your lurkers so you're panicking a little. Bring these guys down. I'm spreading out my roaches in front here. And they're buffering the damage pretty well. As you can see, the lurkers are starting to chop through. So are the ultras. But eventually, the lurkers will be able to take out the ultras. Now, also, even better, sometimes if you really want to defend, what you'll have is spore crawlers in front. Ideally, you want to have as much in the way of roaches and hydras and lurkers as possible. You want to have more than one lurker per ultralisk. In this scenario, we were looking at a total of 12 ultras and, 10 ultras and only 10 lurkers. So, ideally, you have maybe like 15 or 16 by that point, especially cost-wise. And to counter that lurker turtle, you can use Vipers as the ultralisk player, but ideally you're in behind your defenses. You make it as difficult as possible to attack. But these are just the basic counters on paper. I'm just going to describe a few more scenarios. This is not meant to be like every scenario all the time this works, but these are the counters for ultralisk. Roach Hydra can be okay. Let's go back to the open field here for a second. Throw a few more ultralisks on. There are a few more. I mean, on paper, Cyclones. Sometimes we'll see the Liberator Banshee style. If you're the ultralisk player, let's go back to you and your ultras. The ultras are not always the game-ending unit. The ultras force a large response. They are a very beefy unit. They're difficult to kill, which is why we've gone so in-depth about the potential counters. But what you want to be doing when your opponent just has too much to deal with the ultralisk and it seems hopeless, well, that might be a good time to transition into Broodlords. A lot of the reason for that is that a lot of the anti-ultras, like for example, imagine you're looking at this Protoss army here. He's figured out how to counter your ultras. He's figured it out. He's got Immortals. He's got Archons. He's got Zealots. Well, he doesn't have very many ways of dealing with Broodlords, does he? So, always be looking for that opportunity as a Zerg player to transition, and if you are a Protoss or a Terranor Zerg and you're facing the Ultras, realize that if he's keeping you pinned back, then he could be transitioning to Broodlords. This is not just in a vacuum here. This is something like an actual game. So, just keep that in mind. We're not going to go too in-depth. Of course, you can check the tutorials for actual game applications of units and build orders and stuff like that. But hopefully, this was helpful for you newer players out there. Give me some feedback on the guide. If you have any questions, hopefully I can answer in the comments. If there are enough questions, I might make a follow-up video. But hopefully this is helpful for your you very new players out there. I plan on making guides on each unit. I know this is a little bit long-winded, but it's designed to kind of cover all the scenarios for players who might not even have played yet, or bronze, silver, maybe even gold players who just don't know the best units to counter these. But remember, when fighting Ultralisks, minimize their numbers, fight them on your terms, and not theirs. So thank you guys for watching. Good luck, have fun, and happy StarCrafting. See you on the other side.